It starts with a number that doesn't make sense. 2.1 trillion gallons. That is the amount of water vanishing from the American West every single year, consumed by a single crop that almost nobody eats. It's the water that grows the feed for the cows that become your milk and your burger. It's more water than all 40 million people across 7 states use inside their homes combined. And this is the silent catastrophe happening right now, far from the television cameras pointed at Lake Mead. We have spent 2 decades staring at a single bathtub ring etched into a canyon wall, thinking it was the whole story. It was never the whole story. The real crisis is invisible. It's underground, where ancient water reserves are being pumped dry at a rate that can never be refilled. This isn't a drought. It is an emptying, a permanent and irreversible hollowing out of the ground beneath our feet. So the question is no longer about when the lakes will recover. The question is, what happens when we discover the water we were counting on was never really there at all? For a generation, Lake Mead has been the public face of the water crisis. Its decline is a slow, methodical drama. The dropping water levels, the ghost towns and sunken boats re-emerging from the depths. The stark white band of mineral deposits a geological scar marking how much has been lost since 1983, the last year the reservoir was full. As of today, July 11, 2026, the lake's surface sits at an elevation of 1,042.9 feet. That number is a death sentence in slow motion, and it's a number that puts the entire Southwest just a handful of feet away from a disaster, far more immediate than a dry lake bed. Everyone talks about Dead Pool, the 895-foot elevation mark, where water can no longer flow past Hoover Dam, but that's a distant apocalypse. The one that keeps engineers awake at night arrives much sooner. It's called the Power Cliff, and it sits at an elevation of roughly 1,035 feet, just under 8 feet below where the lake is today. At 1,035 feet, the pressure on Hoover Dam's turbines drops so significantly that its ability to generate usable hydropower collapses. The lights don't just go out. The grid that serves millions across Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California plunges into instability. Rolling blackouts, unpredictable surges, a system engineered for a full reservoir suddenly forced to operate on fumes. We have been here before. In July of 2022, the lake hit its all-time record low of 1,040 feet. We are teetering right on the edge of that same record today. The buffer is gone. That single wet winter of 2023 was not a rescue. It was a momentary pause in a century-long decline, and now the crisis is accelerating again. But here's what they don't tell you. Here is the secret that reshapes the entire equation. If Lake Mead hits dead pool, if the water drops to 895 feet, California loses its water. Arizona's aqueducts run dry. Mexico gets nothing, but Las Vegas will be fine. Las Vegas will not go dry. Because while the world was watching the water level drop, the city that should not exist was making a desperate, ruthless, and brilliant billion-dollar gamble. A bet that it could out-engineer the apocalypse. A bet that it has already won. It's called the Low Lake Level Pumping Station. Or, more famously, the third straw. Between 2008 and 2015, the Southern Nevada Water Authority spent $5 billion on a project that many called insane. They drilled a 3-mile tunnel under the floor of Lake Mead itself, a feat of engineering through solid volcanic basalt to build a new water intake. This one sits at an elevation of 875 feet, 20 feet below dead pool. It is a drain at the very bottom of the bathtub. Think about what that means. It's an insurance policy written not against a drought, but against their neighbors. The third straw guarantees that as the lake drains past the point of no return for everyone else, the pumps for Las Vegas will still be running. The casinos will still glow. The fountains will still run. The city played the smartest hand in the desert. They bought their survival by ensuring they would be the last ones left drinking. It was not a growth strategy. It was a survival strategy. And it was a declaration of independence from a river system that was already broken. The city's planners looked at the math of the Colorado River, the flawed 1922 compact that promised more water than nature ever provided, and they understood a fundamental truth. A day was coming when there would not be enough for everyone. And on that day, engineering would matter more than law. The $1.5 billion price tag paid for by the residents of southern Nevada through years of rising water rates wasn't a cost. It was a ransom. The price for living in an impossible place. And while that tunnel provides a terrifying security for one city, it completely distracts from the real catastrophe unfolding beneath the entire American West. The problem wasn't just the lake. The lake was only a symptom. The bathtub ring on Lake Mead is a misdirection. It has captured our attention for decades, a visible, measurable symbol of loss. But the real story of the West's water crisis isn't written on those canyon walls. It's written in the dark, in the dirt, in the ancient geology beneath our feet. Miles away from the Colorado River, under the sprawling farms of California's Central Valley and the vast plains of Texas and Kansas, lies the real emergency. The groundwater. We have been treating these immense underground aquifers like a checking account, but they are a fixed trust fund deposited over thousands of years, and we are draining it in a single lifetime. Take the Ogallala aquifer. It is not a lake. It is a colossal underground reservoir of ancient water, a shallow water table stretching beneath 8 states from South Dakota to Texas. It provides nearly a third of all groundwater used for irrigation in the entire United States. It is the lifeblood of the high plains, the reason the American breadbasket can exist. And we are mining it to extinction. Because the Ogallala recharges so slowly, on a geological timescale measured in millennia, every gallon pumped out is essentially a gallon that is gone forever on a human timescale. Since industrial pumping began in the mid-20th century, parts of the aquifer have dropped more than 200 feet. It is not a drought, it's a permanent depletion. This is the silent crisis. There are no bathtub rings on an aquifer. There are only wells that have to be drilled deeper and deeper until one day they hit dust. And that day is arriving. According to Scott Jasheshko, a professor of water resources at UC Santa Barbara, this isn't a uniquely American problem. Aquifers are being depleted globally. But the American West is a hotspot for this invisible catastrophe. In California, the story is just as grim. During droughts, groundwater can provide up to 60% of the state's entire water supply. It is the emergency reserve, the backup plan. That backup plan is failing. In the San Joaquin Valley, part of California's agricultural heartland, the ground is literally sinking. Decades of overpumping groundwater have caused the land to subside, compacting the empty space where water used to be. The overdraft is estimated at 500,000 acre-feet annually. That's enough water to supply 1 million households, disappearing from beneath the ground every year. This subsidence damages canals, bridges, roads, and building foundations. It is the earth itself giving way, a physical manifestation of a resource that has been pushed past its breaking point. The state of California saw this coming. A decade ago, they passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SHMA. The law mandates that critically overdrafted regions, like the San Joaquin Valley, must achieve sustainability by the year 2040. They must balance what they pump with what naturally recharges. It was a landmark piece of legislation, a promise to fix the problem. But a study published in April 2026 in the journal Water Resources Research delivered a devastating verdict. The study concluded that reaching SGMA's 2040 targets may be nearly impossible in many of these basins. The pressures of climate change, reduced surface water supplies, and rising evaporation are simply too great. The official policy says everything will be fine. The scientific data says the plan is failing. The gap between political promises and physical reality is widening into a chasm. We are hollowing out the very foundation of the West, chasing a finite resource deeper and deeper into the earth, with no real plan for what happens when we reach the bottom. And where is all this water going? Both from the rivers and from the ground? Now we come back to that impossible number, 2.1 trillion gallons. In 2025 alone, that's the estimated water consumption of one single crop across the 7 Colorado River Basin states. Alfalfa. It's a leafy, thirsty plant that most Americans have never seen and will never eat. It is grown, harvested, and used almost exclusively as feed for dairy and beef cows. Let that sink in. Roughly 1/4 of the entire Colorado River, a lifeline for 40 million people, is diverted to grow food for livestock. The sheer scale of this is hard to comprehend. We have created a system where urban residents in cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas are policed for the length of their showers and paid to tear out their lawns. While an amount of water that could solve their shortages many times over is used to feed cattle, the indoor water use of the entire 40 million person population of the basin is less than the water used to grow this one animal feed crop. It is a crisis of priorities, a system of allocation so profoundly illogical it borders on madness. This is the legacy of the 1922 Colorado River Compact. That century-old document, the original sin of Western water law, was signed based on measurements from an abnormally wet period. It allocated rights to water that, in an average year, simply does not exist. For 100 years, the system has coasted on surplus reserves and a prayer for rain. Now the reserves are gone. The climate has shifted from temporary drought to permanent aridification. And the structural deficit that was built into the system from day one is finally coming due. There are signs of change. Under its chief negotiator, J.B. Hamby, California managed to reduce its use of the Colorado River in 2025 to the lowest level since 1949. This happened even as the state's population quadrupled. It's proof that urban conservation works, that cities can decouple growth from water consumption, but these gains are a pittance compared to the agricultural behemoth. The fight isn't really between Los Angeles and Phoenix, it's between burgers and people. And for a century, the burgers have been winning. This crisis, building for 100 years, is no longer a future problem. The bill is due. Now, the winter of 2025 to 2026 was not just a dry year. It was a catastrophe beyond living memory. Raquel Flinker, a water resources director for the Colorado River District, put it bluntly, if there's anything in your memory about a dry year that you've seen, a warm year that you've seen, 2026 is beyond all of that. The system of frozen reservoirs that the West depends upon simply failed. Normally, snowpack in the Rocky Mountains acts as a frozen water tower, as expert Ben Livna calls it. It stores water all winter and releases it slowly in the spring and summer, replenishing the rivers. But this year, it didn't happen. On April 1st, 2026, the snow water equivalent in the upper Colorado River Basin hit a record low of just 23% of the historical average. Then, a record warm March caused that meager snowpack to peak a month early and melt with terrifying speed. The water didn't flow into the streams and rivers. It evaporated or soaked into parched, desperate soil. The runoff was a trickle. Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir, fell to just 24% capacity. The frozen water towers were empty. This physical collapse crashed directly into a political one. The 2007 interim guidelines, the rules that have governed the river for 2 decades, are set to expire at the end of 2026. The 7 basin states were given a deadline by the federal government, February 14, 2026. Deliver a consensus plan for how to share a shrinking river. They failed. The deadline passed with no agreement. The upper basin states and lower basin states remain deadlocked, unable to decide whose sacrifice will be greater. The gridlock has forced the hand of the federal government. The Department of the Interior, led by Secretary Doug Burgum, has announced it is moving forward on its own. By October 1, 2026, his agency will impose its own unilateral rules for managing the river. It's an unprecedented federal intervention into what has always been a matter for the states. Burgum issued a stark warning about the coming plan. Nobody will be happy with it. A June 2026 report from university researchers was even more direct. They warned the entire basin is sliding toward a system crash, and that even a miraculously wet 2027 would only provide a 1 or 2 year cushion. The time for negotiation is over. A showdown between the federal government and 7 sovereign states is now just months away, and it will unfold against the backdrop of reservoirs hovering just feet above failure. We built our world on a series of assumptions. The assumption that the rains would come, that the snow would fall, that the rivers would flow, that if we drilled deep enough, we would always find more. Lake Mead's falling water was a warning that those assumptions were failing. Las Vegas listened. They drilled a $1.5 billion tunnel to reach water that no drought could touch, securing their future at the expense of others. But the real problem was never just a drought. The real problem is that we are draining the well of last resort, the ancient, irreplaceable water buried deep in the ground, water that represents the accumulated savings of millennia. And we are spending it a century. What happens when the problem isn't just a low lake, but a hollowed-out earth? What happens when the ground itself runs dry? The engineering is done, the calculations are made. But beneath the desert, a much larger account is closing, and there is no tunnel deep enough to reach what simply isn't there anymore. The crisis is not coming. It is here. The complex dance of water rights, agricultural subsidies, and urban growth is colliding with the hard wall of physics. On March 25, 2026, Denver Water declared a Stage 1 drought, citing the historically low snowpack. It was a formal acknowledgement of what the data had been screaming for months. The system is broken. Shanti Rossett, a policy manager for the Metropolitan Water District, noted that replacing the old 2007 guidelines is not a routine policy update. It is a fundamental reset of how the system may be operated going forward. That reset is being forced not by politicians, but by hydrology. The fight over the Colorado River's post-2026 future has exposed the deep fractures in the century-old compact. The upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, argue that the lower basin states, Arizona, California, and Nevada, have been using more than their fair share for decades, draining the reservoirs that everyone relies on. The lower basin states counter that their massive agricultural and urban centers were built on the promise of that water, and that drastic cuts would cripple their economies. It's a zero-sum game, played with the fate of 40 million people. Eric Balkin of the Glen Canyon Institute summarized the endgame perfectly. Eventually, every state will have to make a sacrifice. There's only so much water that can be shuffled around. That shuffling is about to be dictated from Washington, D.C., and the consequences will be felt from the farm fields of the Imperial Valley to the suburbs of Denver. And all the while, the silent crisis continues. The Ogallala aquifer doesn't have a compact. The San Joaquin Valley's groundwater doesn't have a federal deadline. It is a slow, quiet, and largely unregulated collapse happening farm by farm, well by well. The illusion of abundance, created by powerful pumps and subsidized energy, allowed generations to believe that water was an infinite input. That delusion is now cracking, just like the parched earth in a failed field. A place like the San Joaquin Valley doesn't just produce food, it produces nearly a quarter of the nation's food, including 40% of its fruits and nuts. Its economy is entirely dependent on water that is, by every scientific measure, disappearing. The story of the West has always been a story of water, of moving it, storing it, fighting over it. We built colossal dams, Hoover, Glen Canyon, to tame a wild river and make the desert bloom. For a time, it worked. We built cities in places nature never intended. We grew crops in sun-scorched valleys. We created an empire of green in a world of brown. But that empire was built on a debt, a water debt, accumulated over 100 years of over-allocation and overconsumption. Climate change is just the interest on that debt, compounding faster and faster every year. Las Vegas built a tunnel to escape its share of the debt from the surface, but no one can escape the debt being run up underground. That is a collective bankruptcy that, when it arrives, will rewrite the map of the American West for centuries to come. The water isn't just low. It's spoken for, over and over again, in a web of promises that can no longer be kept. The final question is not who gets the water, but who has